Hey everyone, it's really great that you can join us. We're going to be spending some time now just thinking about some questions that you might have about the book of Ecclesiastes as we've been going through it these last number of weeks. I want us to be taking our cue from the Bereans in Acts. It says in Acts chapter 17, verse 11, "Now the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness, and they examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true." We can really learn from these Christians about examining the scriptures for ourselves and checking what is said and what is taught against the scriptures. I hope that we will be a church that really does that really examines what's being said up front from the pulpit. Because you see, Jesus rules his church through his word. And so we need to be testing what is said against his word. So let's get to your questions now. Who the king is in Ecclesiastes is a bit of a tricky question. That's because the king is also tied to who the author is and when Ecclesiastes was written. There are generally two views that are held by Bible-believing Christians as to who the king is, and therefore who the author of Ecclesiastes is. The first view is that it is King Solomon, who reigned during the 10th century BC. The second view is that the king is referring to someone who is a son of David, a descendant of David, who lived during the 2nd century BC. The reason for the first view, that it's Solomon who is the king in Ecclesiastes and who wrote the book, is because it says in chapter 1 verse 1, "The words of the teacher, the son of David, king of Israel." It also says in chapter 1 verse 12, "I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem." Now the obvious king, son of David, is likely to be Solomon because of what he goes on to explain his works to have been, and how wealthy he was and how wise he was in chapter 1 verse 16 to chapter 2 verse 9. One question against this view, though, is why does Solomon not name himself? Why does he just talk about himself as the teacher and the things that he's done? I think, though, that in reply to this, that Solomon doesn't necessarily have to name himself if the author is Solomon, because he would have been so well known during his time and after that he wouldn't have needed to say that he is Solomon. Everyone would have known that it is him. The second view is that the author, the king, is a son of David, a descendant of David who lived around the 2nd century BC. This would be someone who lived after the exile to Babylon, after Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. The strongest reason for this view is based on language. Ecclesiastes, scholars tell us, was written in later Hebrew. But they also concede that later Hebrew is not a strict reason for deciding when the book was written, because there's an overlap between early Hebrew and later Hebrew, so deciding it based on language alone is hard to discern. Something else, though, that with regards to language that helps to strengthen the case is that in chapter 2 verse 5 and in 8 verse 11, there are two words that are used. The one is pax in chapter 2 verse 5, and in chapter 8 verse 11, the word sentence. These have Persian origin, and it's likely that Persian words, borrowed words from the Persian language, would have only entered into Hebrew after the Persian Empire was a superpower. Now this would have happened only in about 532 BC, after Persia defeated Babylon. My main criticism against this view, this reason, is that scholars would concede that language alone is not strong enough of a case to make for this view. So what needs to be done is you have to go back into Ecclesiastes and look for other proof to argue your case. One of the ways that this is done is by locating specific verses and pinning them to specific historical events. So, for example, in chapter 9, verse 13 to 16, it talks about a city that's besieged by another empire. And in that city, there's a poor and wise person who helps to save the city. Now, the argument would be that this is talking about Sennacherib coming and invading Judah in 701 BC. You can read about it in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. The problem, though, is that the person who saves Judah and Jerusalem in 2 Chronicles is King Hezekiah, which doesn't seem to fit the person that's talked about in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 15. You see, Ecclesiastes, I think, is making general statements about life in this world and trying to pin them onto specific events and historical events, even within the history of Israel, is a little bit too dubious for me. Personally, I would hold to the view that King Solomon is the king in Ecclesiastes and therefore the author of Ecclesiastes too. But we can't ignore the other view. There is some weight to it. How should we think about this, though? I think that it is okay for Bible-believing Christians to have either view. There are some books in the Bible, both in the New Testament predominantly, and also in the Old Testament, where it matters more who the author is. So, for example, it matters a lot more if Paul is the author of Romans or not. It also matters a lot more if Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament or not. That seems to be less the case with the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes, though, it is God's word, and it is useful for teaching, correcting, rebuking, and training us in righteousness. And therefore, we cannot ignore it. In my last sermon, we thought about the different kinds of people who are on the ladder of life. And we thought about the person who's right at the bottom and the person who's right at the top, but we didn't look at everyone else in between, just because we didn't have the time to do that. But here they are, and let me run through them just so you can go and have a look for yourself. The second person is the lazy person in chapter 4, verse 5. We might think that that's a bit strange, that there would be someone there who is lazy, but the point that's being made is that whether it's envy and we work hard, or laziness and we do nothing, it still damages the relationships that we have. So we're trying to step on someone to get up the ladder, or we're just doing nothing so that we can get what we can off someone else. The third person is in chapter 4, verse 8. And they're the person who works hard, and they only have themselves to work for. They're the workaholic. They spend all their time in the office. They don't have family, they don't have time for friends, they don't have time for anything else but work. The fourth person is chapter 4, verse 13, and it's a foolish king. A king who was old and foolish, and very quickly lost their throne to someone who was young and wise. So we see that this is also someone who gets toppled over very quickly. The fifth person is in chapter 5, verse 8. And what we see here is that it doesn't matter where you are in the ladder or on the ladder, there's always going to be someone above you, except for when you're right at the top. But as we saw, even if you get to the top, you might not even be able to enjoy what you have. The sixth person is the person in chapter 5, verse 13 and 14. They're the person who works hard for their family. It talks about this person having a son, but they lose everything that they have. In the end, it was worth nothing. It was meaningless, because they'd spent so much time working and building up to provide for those that they love, and in the end lost it all. So those are the 7 people on the ladder of life. Ecclesiastes is not a book that we're really familiar with. It's hard to understand, and it's also hard to accept. In answering this question, I just want to clarify what we mean by meaningless, because the word that our Bibles use and our translations use is meaningless. It's the word that we've talked about before, hevel. Now, meaningless is not necessarily the most helpful word. Rather, the word mist or transience or smoke or something like that is better, because it captures the idea that you can't hold on to life. It just blows away. This is why life is so frustrating. You see, it's not that our work and relationships and things like that are meaningless, but it's that they're transient, they're mist, they don't last. And this is what makes life so frustrating. Because even when you have the good thing in life, you can't hold on to it. It just blows away. Or you yourself blow away in the end. And what we find hard to accept about Ecclesiastes is that if this is what life is like, if you can't hold on to anything, then what is it all worth in the end? Because in the end, it just gets blown away. Ecclesiastes is helping us to see that we can't have ultimate happiness and satisfaction in this life. Now, we don't even like that as Christians. See, more often than not, we live our lives trying to find happiness and satisfaction in our work, in pleasure, in possessions, in holidays, in friends, in fame, in family. The point of Ecclesiastes is that we can't. But it's when we learn to see life as it really is, that we then begin to enjoy life for what it is, as a gift. You see, it means that we stop using the things of this world to ultimately satisfy us and make us happy. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 15 says that this world is twisted and we can't straighten it out. And we can't use the things of this world to straighten out life, to save us. But it's when we learn that we begin to appreciate the good things that God has given us and enjoy them for what they are, being thankful for them, knowing that they don't have to ultimately satisfy us and make us happy. Yeah, that's a good question. So what we must remember is that I think in the first talk, and we saw in chapter 1 verse 1, that this book is the words of the teacher, and we saw that the word for teacher there is kohelet, the person who speaks to the assembly. So first of all, this book is not for the non-Christian, the person who doesn't know God and lives life in this world thinking that there is no God. It's actually for the Christian, which is not what we always expect. We often think of Ecclesiastes as like a gospel tract that shows you how depressing life is without God and then quickly pops God out at the end of the book to convince you that life only has meaning when God is in the picture. But as we've been seeing in the last few talks, God is consistently there. This is His world, and Ecclesiastes is painting the picture of what life is like in God's world. And so firstly, we as Christians need to take in the truths that it's saying to us. We need to rightly understand what this world is like now. And we need to understand what we are like now in light of this book. That said, Ecclesiastes is a helpful book because it does address and bring up and try to answer the questions of life. So it is the question that the teacher asks. He says, meaningless, meaningless, in chapter 1, verse 2. Everything is meaningless. Verse 3, what does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? What's the point of life? And those are questions that everyone asks about life at some point. And particularly now, during this time, Those are big questions that people are asking, and partly why we're going through Ecclesiastes now. And so, although Ecclesiastes isn't the easiest book to read, I wouldn't recommend it as the first book that you take someone who's not a Christian that you know to. It might be better to go to a gospel like the Gospel of Mark, where they can see and hear from Jesus directly and see what he did and what he said. Also, the type of book that Ecclesiastes is it's not familiar to us, and so it's a bit harder to understand. But that said, use these talks, use these online resources at the moment to share with friends, to share with family who aren't Christians. Because Ecclesiastes will be saying something to them about what life is about and how they can find true meaning in living in this world of Havel. Thanks so much again for joining us. I hope this question time was really helpful. We're going to be trying to do that as we go on as a church together, as we look at different books together and different parts of the Bible together. And we're going to be taking a break from Ecclesiastes for a bit, but we are going to come back to it and look at the rest of what it has to say to us.